You're listening to Biotech Hangout, a live and unedited weekly discussion of all the latest news in our industry with a group of biotech insiders. I'm Paul Matteis, and my co-hosts today are John Maraganore, Eric Schmidt, and Graig Suvannavejh. For more information about our hosts and guest speakers, or to listen to the most recent episode, please go to biotechhangout.com. So, with that, always good to kick it off with the discussion around sentiment. And I feel like we had an incredible streak, at least with Eric and I on the show a while ago, where just every week we were just lamenting how much of a bummer it is. But it feels like, the XBI has been strong. And, I'm sure we all get asked by people, like, do you think this is sustainable? And, outside of certain, there's always the same kind of risks out there, right? Still some noise around drug pricing. But it to me, it feels like we're seeing a bunch of tailwinds, right? More M&A, good stock reactions on positive data. We've talked about smaller, mid-sized companies successfully launching drugs. There's noise about interest rates coming down. I mean, the list goes on. So I guess, not just, we can all talk about the factors, but I think it would be good to just maybe even hear, and maybe Graig, you can start, and then we can go around the horn. Like, how do we feel about this market and how sustainable this market is going to be over the next 6 to 12 months?
Yeah, thanks, Paul, and thanks for having me. It's been really interesting to see, particularly as I've been able to do marketing meetings, which for those of you who are on this podcast for sell side analysts, when we go marketing, we travel throughout the country to visit with buy side investors to get a sense of what they're interested in. And in the past 2, 3 weeks, I've been able to market in Boston, in Dallas, and I'm actually doing this podcast from San Francisco right now, but I was visiting with investors in San Diego and even LA. And yes, there are some in LA. But that being said, it does, of course, seem that sentiment in biotech is very positive right now. I think it's caught a lot of people by surprise. Certainly, if you look at the stock charts, and as imperfect as the XBI may be as a proxy for sentiment, I think there's also another ETF that's relatively new to me that someone pointed out is called the BBC. But we're talking about, in the past 6 months, 40+% performance for at least the XBI, and it's even closer to 80% for this BBC ETF, which tracks more earlier clinical stage companies. And so it's been happening, and clearly it came off of the lows 6 months ago of the tariff announcements by the current administration. So obviously the comp is quite easy, but it really feels to me that in the past month or so, it just feels very, very tangible. People are asking, what has changed, if anything has changed. And I do think that sets up an interesting conversation we could have in terms of, has anything really fundamentally changed? But certainly like macro things, as Paul pointed out earlier, with regards to like uncertainty earlier in the year with respect to Washington, D.C. policy and their approach to healthcare, whether it was RFK Jr. and what he might have brought forth, changes at FDA. And obviously, given noise around potential forcing of lower prices for the pharmaceutical industry. But I think where we are today is that it's not really as bad as people think. There's still the uncertainty of every day and what may come out of Washington, D.C. But I think from an investor perspective, worst case fears have not materialized. We do have positive data sets that are being reported. Stocks are moving up higher. Smaller companies are able to raise significant amounts of capital, and you do see follow through performance. We've got an administration that's generally trying to lower interest rates, which I think for the narrative is good for the biotech sector. So, I think there are lots of different factors. Now, how sustainable this is, I think that is the key question, and we're always trying to figure that out. I do think what we'd like to see, at least from my perspective, we'd like to see a very gradual, sustained increase. versus some very meteoric, rocket ship-like performance for biotech, because then that sets up the potential of a crash sometimes thereafter. But I'd love to hear, what my other panelists think about where we are in biotech sentiment and how long it may last.
Yeah, Eric, John, what do you guys think?
Well, I'll maybe just jump in real quickly. I saw a stat yesterday that I thought was encouraging. This is now the second straight week of positive net fund flows into the sector, which we haven't had that in quite a while. And I do think the sentiment is getting stronger. I think it's probably driven by the interest rate cuts that we saw and expectations for more of that, and then sort of the numbing of the Washington policy risks and environment, and obviously the continued drumbeat of M&A. So it's all coming together, I think, in a way that's good, and I do think it'll be sustainable. Maybe more gradual over time, but it is going to be a sustainable recovery, and it's been a long time. It's been a super long time. It's been a very cold
Seriously.
winter.
I know.
Yeah.
I feel like 2021 to just a couple months ago. Eric, what do you think about the sustainability of this? And maybe you can also comment on just the regulatory environment biotech right now and how much of an opportunity or risk is that for the run? Because you and I have talked about kind of on the one hand, how the FDA is communicating a lot of sort of rosy, flexible, sweetheart deals to a number of companies. But on the other hand, you've been dealing with this Scholar Rock situation, and we've seen other sort of signs of maybe reduced FDA productivity. I mean, let's hear your overall thoughts, but I love your perspective there as
Yeah, thanks for that, Paul. And I loved how Greg set up this discussion. I think he did it extremely eloquently in terms of, okay, what's going on out there? Yes, he's right. And John, you're right too. There's no doubt there's an influx of funding coming in. Paul, you and I were on the Hangout a couple of weeks ago. We talked about really back then for the first time getting a few calls, or maybe now starting to get more calls from generalists. And that's certainly continued for the last 2 or 3 weeks. There's a deluge of interest right now from folks that we really hadn't talked to for months or years into the past. So, that's the driver for why the XBI has outperformed. I think the XBI has now outperformed the S&P 500 by a whopping 17% since the beginning of September. That is a crazy amount of outperformance relative to the broader index in a very short period of time. So that can only be one thing: money coming into the sector, as John mentioned, and we should enjoy it while it lasts. It's been a long time. I do think that biotech was oversold. I do think that we were being punished for reasons that we had, maybe no deserving to be punished for. But again, the question is, well, what really has changed? And honestly, I'm not sure that things have changed that much. I don't think they were ever as bad as folks thought back in March or April, and maybe we need to be a little bit careful that today they're not quite as good as the stock performance might have you think. And you brought up the FDA, Paul. Yeah, I'll pick at that a little bit. I think that we've still got an agency that's very politicized. We know that coming off of the Tylenol and leucovorin debacle of a few weeks ago. We've still seen some, I don't know, misadventures with regard to the FDA being able to get its work done on time, not just inspecting facilities, but also pushing out PDUFA dates here and there. People have brushed some of this stuff under the cover, but under the rug. But I think it's quite real. And then actually, Stat News did a nice piece earlier in the week, this week, just on how the environment in terms of the culture and organizational abilities of the FDA still seems to be under distress. I guess they were noting the leucovorin approval in particular and talking about how that had come top down from the agency brass to the review staff. And you can imagine it was kind of forced upon the agency in a way that ruffled some feathers. So I think we need to be careful. A lot of great innovation going on out there, but our government may not be operating under the best of efficiencies right now. So that would be my thought, but love to hear your thoughts, Paul.
No, I think in general, as long as these concessions we're seeing from some of the leading therapeutics companies really in the pharma space, as long as the ways that they are for lack of a better term, kind of kissing the ring a bit, right, to the Trump administration and moving manufacturing, as long as that can kind of stave off the worst case scenario of true tangible MFN or some sort of other policy that's going to impact like a broader array of companies, I feel like the sector's in an okay spot, right? Because it's M&A continues to seem inevitable, right? So like I think that's going to be there, right, to maybe buoy things or kind of raise the floor. So I'm feeling okay, I think, and look, I mean, maybe COVID is not the right sort of benchmark to think about whether or not the XBI is quote unquote expensive, because that was a little crazy, but we're so far from that still. So, does anyone want to kind of comment on how they think about the IPO market? I'm going to kind of step aside from this conversation just because, there's but anyone else want to kind of chime in there on the IPOs, or do we want to go to news?
Yeah, I'm happy to comment, and it comes from the perspective of recently visiting with some private biotech companies, and particularly some that are later stage in their cycle, and by that I mean they're either running a phase 2 or a phase 3 program with prospects of data coming out, sometime over the next 12 months. And in speaking with them, one in particular was just out. They had an update where they wanted to go out to their existing investors. And so they visited with their investors in Boston and New York and in the Baltimore area. And I think the view is that people feel good about where we are. Clearly, we're at the end of the year. And with the end of the year, that means we've got the, big party of JP Morgan Healthcare Conference just a few months away. And I think, with this year, we've seen a few issues, filing. I think MapLight filed recently. I think, LB Pharma went out and had a decent IPO. But I do think that in speaking not only with private companies and what they're hearing from investors, but also with friends that I have in healthcare banking, and also contacts that I've spoken with who are working at the law firms. There is a lot of excitement. There's a lot of activity happening. I do think that we are looking at a potential, new window opening up that would be coincident with, the first quarter or second quarter. I'm not an investment banker, so I'm not the smartest to be talking about these things necessarily. But based on what I'm hearing, and given where we are, particularly when looking at the XBI, for example, I do think there is lots of positive energy right now in terms of where people feel about the IPO window for biotech opening up again.
The other
Yeah.
other thing I'd just add on. Oh, sorry, John, go ahead.
No, go ahead. Go ahead, Eric.
The quality of private companies that we're seeing is extremely high. These companies have not had an opportunity to go public for now several years, and honestly, the best ones don't want to test the water. They don't want to be first to put a toe in. So they've been waiting very peacefully, building, creating, innovating, and I can't believe how many wonderful companies we're meeting with, week in, week out these days. Because yes, they are, as Graig says, all sort of gearing up and thinking about going public, and it's going to be an amazing crop of companies. It may be one of the best quality years we ever see in 2026. At least I am hopeful that these inflows continue and the XBI continues to move in the positive direction, and we could see a very, very great year for IPOs. So from my lips to God's ears.
That's really the point I was going to jump in on, Eric. So thanks for starting that side of it. I do think the consequence of a very long, dark um, winter here for biotech and on the private side means that the companies that have made it through to this point are, by far, you know, road tested and stronger than what you normally would see. And they're also more mature because they've had to stay private longer. So they're not coming out with, preclinical ideas, but they're coming out with, phase 2, phase 3 um, programs with strong proof of concept and very, very promising therapeutic areas with real differentiation. So I I do think the vintage 2026 IPOs is going to be about as good as it gets in in winemaking of biotech companies, and I think we should all be excited about that, because it will create hopefully um, a more solid foundation for the years to come as more companies mature and get ready to go public.
Makes sense. All right. Glass half full. John, do you want to comment on the CNPV decisions? What do you think of the list? Any patterns you're noticing here, and how do you see the implication?
Well, thanks. I mean, look, you know, the CMPV program was introduced earlier this year by Commissioner Macri, and I think there was at the time there was some mixed feelings about it. I think there was, you know, Adam Feuerstein had a very negative feeling about it, as I recall. Maybe it was Matt Herper, I'm not sure which one, but they worried about it being very political, very driven by you know, sort of the whims of RFK, if you will, or other you know drivers in the whole thing. You know, I for one felt, hey, this is great. We need more accelerated approval pathways. We need more ways of recognizing the apex of innovation and getting these drugs to patients faster. So, you know, I've always been positive, constructively positive on the program in principle. And I was delighted to see the list come out yesterday. There were nine approvals, or nine programs that were put into the bucket of the CNPVs. And just a reminder, I mean, the CNPV program is aiming to get um, reviews, NDA or BLA reviews within 1 to 2 months of submission. So a pretty remarkable acceleration of, you know, getting a drug approved compared to the normal, you know, 9 to 12 months, if you're lucky, type of process. So I think this is good. Now, the list of nine drugs, I had a couple of observations. One is there were definitely some very innovative, highly innovative drugs that, you know, I think any one of us would say, you know, should get recognized and should get this nomination. The DB auto off their decibel acquisition for hereditary deafness is one of them. Bitopertin, which is the disc drug for erythropoietic protoporphyria. And then the other notable one to me was the Revolution Medicine RM6236 RAS drug for pancreatic cancer. I mean, those three are drugs I know about and have high regard for the science and what's behind them. Then the other part of the list, which was quite curious, quite interesting, but it makes sense, was that there were augmentin for a U.S. manufacturing supply and ketamine for a U.S. manufacturing supply. I mean, two, you know, core drugs in patient care that and for hospital needs that you know, are subject to shortages and clearly are reliant upon you know, ex-US manufacturing. So that was interesting. So it was a bit of a mix, I would say. You know, as much as I love the innovative products, I don't know how they really fit in what we read about the mandate of this program when it was first initiated, of being somehow involved in the national interest, national, you know, security interests of the country. You know, it's sort of hard to make that case for these, but they are really innovative drugs. So my net on this is it's good. I would like to understand the process a little bit better and the criteria. I have companies in my landscape that have thought about this program, but it's unclear to most of them, if not all of them, as to what really merits, you know, consideration under the program. So I do think and hope that there's more transparency around the process from FDA on this program going forward. But look, I'm happy with the list. I'm happy to see these things happening. I'm happy to see drugs get to patients faster. That's what matters at the end of the day. And sure, I'm sure there's reasons to be critical of anything, but this is a net positive. And I was also good to see some of the market reaction to these products and the companies that had them, which is what we've seen historically with breakthrough therapy designation as well. So I'll pause there and see if anybody wants to add anything to it as well.
I mean, great introduction, John. I think that we too are hopeful, right? We have to be hopeful, and shorter review times, as you say, can't be a bad thing. I do think a little bit of the proof is in the pudding here, right? We are not quite sure that the FDA is going to be able to hit this 1 or 2 month review cycle, and that they'll make the right decisions coming out of that review cycle. But this is a good start. It also sounds like there's another tranche coming. Dr. Makari was
Yes.
very, very clear that even within weeks, we could see a whole nother second tranche. So I'm with you. We could use a little bit more transparency to the process, but the more the merrier here if he continues to choose reasonable things. There's one drug on this list that caught my attention, teplizumab from Sanofi, which
Yeah.
actually failed, I think, in a trial. So I was scratching my head on that one. I guess that was kind of the oddball to me. And then there was also a very interesting comment. I'm sure you picked up on this too, Dr. Makari, when he was referencing the Regeneron DB-OTO for deafness, the gene therapy, said it could be priced at a very, very low price point or even given away for free.
Yeah.
So that had to catch all of our attention. If pricing is, part and parcel or part of the bargain here, that's just something to consider, that you're paying to play, and that you may not be able to get the return on your innovation that you otherwise might. Now, Len has always been interested in fair drug pricing, going back to, I think, his Roy Vagelos days of how this industry ought to be very citizen-minded in its approach. But we'll see if maybe, that product made the list because of a very low price point that they aim to provide the drug at.
I guess
Eric,
one
John,
other thing to consider, Eric, is we'll have to see over time if there's a view on how these products with this rapid approval are viewed, um, either from the standpoint of trust, public trust around their safety and efficacy, and then we'll also have to see over time how programs that are reviewed on this priority, review voucher program are viewed from a payer perspective as well. I'm going to stay optimistic on those two for now, but that is something which we'll have to see with how this evolves.
Great points.
All right. Well, let's
I need.
go ahead, Greg.
I was gonna say I need to get much. I was gonna say like I need to get much smarter around this new program, and I'm just curious for those who do know a lot more than I do. Kind of the process, and clearly we had the list that came out last night, but I've don't have any good visibility or knowledge as to how many other applications are in, and kind of if you're a company and you apply for this, do you get a rejection as well? Do you know the status of what happens, or is it there another batch of drugs that will be added to this list at some point in the future? I think for companies in particular, as this is all relatively new for many of us, it'd be interesting, how this all plays out.
Yeah, my sense, Greg, is that, and you know what, I have one company I cover that I probably should hit them up today and say, hey, did you get a rejection or not, right? Because I'm pretty certain that they applied. But I've heard anecdotally, I don't know if others have heard anything differently, that companies who applied for this were, a little bit in the dark. I think there were well over 100 applications. I don't know if there's a more up-to-date number, but there were a lot who applied. And I think that there's still a question around, for certain types of drugs, what this means as it relates to, I guess, like regulatory de-risking broadly, right? Like if you are a company and you think you could be ready to file for approval, but that's not 100% certain with at the division level, and then you get a CNPV, is that an endorsement that, hey, this now does look approvable? And I can think of a couple scenarios of that as well. So I mean, to me, I'm like still, it feels like it's going to be very like case specific in how you interpret this. Does anyone know how this is communicated to other companies who didn't get chosen?
Not yet. And I think you're right. There are well over 100 applications that went in. for this program, and but there was a lot of uncertainty around what the standards and criteria are. So let's see how maybe we're going to sort of experientially get to the right type of guidelines and approaches here as things get selected. But more to come, I'm sure.
Oh,
Yeah,
it's
because just as a quick follow-up, like I cover a few companies that have seen the remarkable success of Revolution Medicines, and certainly if you look at the stock, you look at the market cap, clearly, well liked by investors. But I cover a few smaller companies, in the less than 500 million market cap range that are trying to do like a fast follower approach, and I'm curious as to whether, because Revolution Medicines for their 6236 program now have this, if they automatically are not eligible to pursue the same thing. Like, there's just lots of questions, which it'll be very fascinating to see how this all develops.
and again, I don't want to be the glass half empty guy, but the other consideration is with all the resources going into potentially support rapid approvals for this list of 9 programs and presumably another list of some odd number of programs coming. I think Dr. Makari said within the next weeks. We just hope that the FDA has the resources to keep its eye on the ball with regard to standard review applications, right? We know, again, that there's some
Right.
chinks in the armor here, and the FDA isn't necessarily operating at 60 miles an hour, its full potential pace. So I hope that we're not robbing Peter to pay Paul in any way with regard to the resources.
Very
So
important,
maybe,
very important point, Eric.
absolutely. Eric, do you want to talk about the GLP-1 pricing comments that came out of the White House? And I think, more broadly, what are you saying to investors around drug pricing risk for the sector right now? Like, I guess what I'm saying, and you tell me if you disagree, is like, I think for the most part, it feels okay. I don't think rhetoric ever goes away on the margin, but, I kind of agree with the consensus view that some sort of broader MFN selecting a bunch of drugs. I'm not losing sleep over that. But I am, ready for any given tweet at any given time that can move a stock or two. But what's your perspective on this GLP-1 stuff and just kind of where you think we're going on the pricing?
Yeah, I generally agree with you, Paul. I think what you said was well said. I mean, first we should just recap, since this program was recorded earlier in the day on Friday, that last Friday we had the second announcement of an MFN deal between AstraZeneca and the White House, and that seemed pretty straightforward and boilerplate, right? So that wasn't maybe nearly as surprising or innovative in the wake of Pfizer a couple weeks earlier. But certainly it gives you a pretty good roadmap for what's likely to happen for future pharmaceutical companies as they come and cut their deal, and hopefully it doesn't seem like it's particularly costly in terms of the drug pricing hits that these companies are going to take. So I would be encouraged by the track record we've seen thus far. And then you're right, just last night we had kind of another wacky tweet come out from the White House. It was kind of immediately almost corrected or rephrased by Dr. Oz, who said, no, President Trump doesn't really mean that, we're going to bring down the price of these GLP-1s to $150 out of pocket. They may come out a little bit higher than that. So I guess we'll all wait for Lilly and for Novo to cut their own deals with the White House and see where this comes. But my guess is if these pharma companies, with all their sophistication and financial planning and analysis powers, if they're cutting a deal with the government, it's probably going to be an okay deal economically for them. And of course, a lot has been made for the fact that Pfizer hasn't had to restate guidance or refile with any SEC paperwork, any changes to its financial condition in the wake of its deal with the White House. So yeah, I'm with you. I think that we can live with what seems to be happening. I don't think it's the end of the day by any means, or the end of the road for drug pricing discussions, right? This, unfortunately, is going to be a tense topic for probably as long as all of us are alive. And John, I'm very interested in your views on just that. But
if I could chime in real quick,
I would just hate to have the kneecaps of one of the pharma CEOs right now. That's all I could say.
Right. I mean, I think like the interesting thing that we've seen with these deals is, companies are benefiting, in my opinion, from the opacity around the true cost of a drug, right? I can't say I've done the math on everything, but just some of these deals where it's okay, this drug's going to be sold direct to consumer or through Trump RX for this discount. I mean, you look at it and just you're like at least me in my head, I'm like, I wonder how different that is really to the gross to net, right? So I mean, these companies are smart, and I think there's a dynamic with this so far that is not that dissimilar to the dynamic with the IRA, where there's a sticker price cut number or a political price cut number, and then there's the true underlying impact to the business, which I'm sure there's a drug or two that's gone so far gone through this where like an estimate might need to be re-rated, but just generally speaking, these deals feel very benign to me. John, do you have anything to add?
No, I do think that they've been cushioned, in their design by the pharma companies to mitigate any meaningful impact on the business. And I think it is. I think you're exactly right, Paul. It's all sort of caught in the sausage making between gross to net and discounts and rebates and the whole nine yards. And so it I think the net impact is really quite small of what we've seen so far. So that's good, because I think it means that the innovation will get rewarded, and maybe the things that get less rewarded are the middlemen who might get squeezed out of something. So that's good.
Makes sense. So maybe we'll talk about some news. I thought an interesting deal this week was the BioCryst acquisitions of Astria Therapeutics. And it was an interesting deal on a few levels. One, I mean, this BioCryst is not that big of a company, right? So to do a deal that is for the better part of $1 billion, I mean, that's a pretty significant acquisition for a small company. Two, it's consolidation of two players in the HAE space. BioCryst has a product for prevention of hereditary angioedema attacks. These are these intermittent swelling attacks. Astria was developing another product for attack prevention that's sort of a next generation version of Takhzyro. And so just the therapeutic area overlap there, I mean, to me, it feels like a fairly smart deal, right? A BioCryst stock reaction was not initially positive, but just in general, I mean, I think one thing I've thought about I cover KalVista and just kind of, have covered a number of smaller size rare disease companies in the past where, investors are looking at market opportunities that are in the hundreds of millions, not the billions. I do think it's hard for small companies sometimes to get full credit for an asset that might not meet that critical mass for some investors. I think sometimes in small cap biotech, investors can be blockbuster hunters and they're less interested in a company that might trade at an attractive multiple of something that is kind of in the sub 500 million range. And so I wonder if we'll see more of this. There's also the FTC question, right? Because these companies are directly overlapping, but I mean, this FTC seems like it's not a hot take, right? Far less strict than its predecessor. So wondering if anyone else had any views on this deal, or just what do you think about small companies doing BD like this? I mean, it's not common. It's not common at all.
Well, I love this deal, Paul, for the reasons you said, right? This is a company in BioCryst that knows exactly what it's buying and how it's going to fit in the market. So companies sticking to their knitting and doubling down on indication, getting stronger, that's what M&A should be about. And the only potential concern might be, as you said, the FTC. I had the same thought you had, and maybe because there are just so many new players in this HAE space, it's much more unlikely that we see any one transaction trigger the attention. And you're right, the political environment's more favorable here. So hats off to both companies. I know Astria used to be Catabasis and has been surviving for
Right.
15, 20 years now. So
Yeah, man.
they finally had their little exit, and congrats to Joe Mellon and her team.
Yeah, that's a throwback, Catabasis. Yeah, I mean, I feel like in the HAE space, it's become crowded enough that it can be. I mean, it varies company to company, stock to stock, but I think it's hard for individual companies in this area to get full credit for what they're doing because of the theoretical uncertainty around what the 5-year competition outlook looks like. And I know Calvista so far has had a promising first quarter of their launch in the acute space, but they're still, to some investors, a show me story. Well, if anyone else wants to comment here, please feel free. But I guess if not, Eric, do you want to run through some more news? I think you wanted to talk about Legend and Scholar Rock, but maybe we can have you kind of hit these one by one and see if others want to chime in.
I mean, maybe I'll just
Yeah.
add before we turn over to Eric, just on, I guess, consolidation in the biotech space. I mean, I think there is a view amongst investors that the denominator in terms of how many companies we have is very high. I do think that, given the capital needs of all of these companies, like it's going to be very difficult for every company to raise the financing that they need to be able to advance their program. So I do think that while potentially sad on one level if one company is no longer able to stand alone on its own and it merges or gets acquired by another company, but I do think bigger picture, it is quite healthy for the industry, right? Clearly, we all talk about the, let's call it, excesses of 2020 2021 in terms of how many companies came out as new public entities and whether they were ready for prime time. And we've made a comment earlier about how, and I would agree, we feel that the 2026 class, and hopefully there is a very nice class of new IPOs, are likely to be very high quality names. But I do think that this natural evolution of our biotech industry, even though it could involve job losses, which we don't like to see, but I think it's very healthy. And I like seeing deals that are strategic, and hopefully not deals that are just what we used to see in large cap pharma. I think way back when in the 2000s, I always felt that it was almost like two struggling companies that simply decided to like merge, and there was lots of synergies that you could like wring out, and hopefully putting two ugly companies together made one somewhat prettier company. And I don't know if that ever really worked out, but I think here, as it relates to biotech, I hope we do see a lot more M&A in the space.
Makes sense. Eric, do you want to run through some news in your space?
Yeah, it sounds like you're giving me my pick of the litter. So thank you for that, Paul. I thought maybe we'll start with the Scholar Rock Regeneron news, as it sort of more broadly impacts a few companies. And one of these companies, of course, is up in your and John's neck of the woods in Boston, Scholar Rock, a company that I'm close to. I think for those who missed the news, this company and Regeneron are sort of cuddled together in terms of being derailed and delayed in approval of new drugs due to a fill finish plant that's now owned by Novo. It used to be owned by Catalent, and that plant got what's called an OAI letter earlier in the week. And that means that in order for the plant to regain compliance, it's going to need to go through a reinspection, and that reinspection is almost certainly likely to take some time, number of months, before you can schedule and then complete and then validate the reinspection and recompliance. And the end net result of all this is that patients are waiting for drugs. In particular, in Scholar Rock's case, they're waiting for, I would say, a very important drug for patients, younger patients, children with SMA, spinal muscular atrophy, a terribly debilitating genetic disease. And this is really unfortunate. Maybe in Regeneron's case, we don't necessarily need to the degree that we need Scholar Rock's apitegromab. Maybe we don't need another, high dose formulation of Eylea. But the fact that we are waiting around for a number of months, maybe even longer than that, in order to get approval for a drug that has passed all other requirements for approval. It's got good safety and efficacy to support it, and this is just a fill finish procedure a fill finish facility. And to the extent that we're aware, there's actually nothing wrong with the product that is coming out of that facility with regard to apitegromab's quality control and metrics. It just happens to be that this drug is being produced in this facility, and this facility doesn't have overall compliance. And therefore, according to FDA mandates and regulations, they can't approve the drug. So what a shame for the industry. Maybe we can do something better. Maybe the FDA has to take a look at how it's really regulating these processes, because this one seems quite unfortunate for patients.
What do you think the
The
reason
other
is?
shame,
Oh, go ahead, John.
yeah, I was going to say the other shame, I think, here, Eric, is that here we are with this zeal to domesticate manufacturing capacity within the United States and do everything we can to onshore, every aspect of manufacturing. And here's a facility in Indiana, where actually the author of the Biosecure Act, Senator Young, is their representative in Washington, and this facility in his state is running against these issues. Now, these aren't trivial things to fix, but you'd expect to see a higher level of urgency to get this one done, and support from the agency, of course, and other stakeholders to try to remediate the situation so that there is a comfort level around manufacturing in that facility, as opposed to going to someplace else like China or Europe or wherever the case might be. So it is sadly ironic, in this era, that this is happening.
Excellent point.
What do you guys think the read through is? I mean, I know this is a frustrating situation that, maybe feels like there's elements of it that could be like avoidable, but like, you're talking to an investor, Eric, like, how do you use this situation to kind of, gauge risk in other situations?
Well, that's the problem, Paul. I mean, up until we had a little bit of head time and lead warning on this, but up until August, none of us who were covering this company or Regeneron had any idea that this was an issue, right? And now, 2 months later, we get a little bit more sense of the potential extent of the issue and the timeline delay, and it is a significant one. And yet we had no knowledge of it. So the good news here, if you will, the silver lining it is just a matter of when these drugs are going to get approved, not if. And investors, as you know, they always like to buy the delay and sell the disaster. So this is not a disaster. Both these companies have kind of hung in. Kudos to both management teams. They've been extremely transparent, on a weekly basis on the kind of progress they're making or are not making. So they've been able to preserve their credibility. But unfortunately, we don't know what the timelines are, and that can be frustrating.
All right. Yeah. Banging your head against the wall a bit. Hopefully it gets better. John, do you want to talk about the Stat Summit panel you sat on with Chris Viehbacher and Emma Walmsley on pharma and the 10-year outlook? That sounded pretty interesting, and I'm sure it'll spark a number of us who want to chime in.
Yeah, it was. I mean, Stat does such a great job, at the summit meetings they've got, and this was no different, in that regard. I mean, of course, we had a hard act to follow. We had baby KJ on the stage before us, so it wasn't easy to be a second act to that amazing story by any accounts. But it was a panel on the future of biopharma, and had a big focus on pricing and MFN and deals. I mean, look, it was, I think, between Emma, Chris, and I, we were all generally positive about the future of the industry, even with the policy headwinds that we have been experiencing this year. And I think it just really highlights the resiliency of the sector to adapt to different, legislative or administrative changes that may happen with governments. And so I think it just points to, at the end of the day, we're treating disease, and our medicines are very important, and therefore, we do have to find ourselves comforted by the fact that we'll always be wanted, and we're needed for sure. Chris, Viehbacher, made some interesting points, of course, as always. And one point that I thought he was right on is he was commenting on just all the GLPs that are out there right now, that are under development. And he was appropriately saying that he's hoping that more of the sector focuses on other aspects of innovation out there. It seems like people are now doubling down, tripling down on different incremental aspects of that category. Although there's probably still a lot more to be done there. The former NIH director, Monica Bertagnoli, was in the audience, and she asked a question about, how industry and academia can better work together. And that led to an interesting discussion around public trust and, belief in the quality of science that comes out of the industry, which I thought was a good discussion. We obviously talked about vaccines, and with Emma being on the stage, and she was very clear that GSK is currently cautious on the U.S. right now as it relates to their vaccine business, and but that they are keeping a long-term perspective on it, that they ultimately realize that their vaccines are critical for public health, and that this too shall pass. And then, of course, we talked about China, and I'm obviously made the point on this topic to highlight that we really are at a Sputnik moment where we should address the competition from China with initiatives and policies, and maybe CNPV is one of these, where we accelerate getting our medicines to patients faster in this country, including getting clinical trials done quicker, and generating clinical evidence for less money and so forth. Those would be a game changer. And then at the end, there was a very fun exchange, I have to say, about leucovorin, because Matt Herper, who moderated the panel, tried to get Emma to comment a little bit about it, and Emma was very clear that in their view it was simply as she called it, an administrative matter. Um, when I was asked about it, I simply said I just hope they stay grounded in the science. I left it at that. But it was a good panel and a good discussion, and I think there were other good summit discussions this year as well.
Excellent, John. Um, that's great. Well, we've got a lot of other topics we can potentially hit on. I'm wondering, Eric or Greg, is there anything that stands out to you guys that you want to talk about next?
Paul, I want to hear you talk about Praxis, if you don't mind, because that was the one stock that this week was at least up 100% plus, and it seems like almost
Yeah,
every week we have one of these, I guess, Phoenix from the ashes kind of stories in biotech.
I know. Okay. Well, yeah, let's do it. So Praxis announced positive data that, needless to say, was a surprise for their essential tremor program. And I think the backdrop here is, first of all, we've had mixed data for this program all along, right, including a pivotal trial failure earlier. And just more broadly, this space has been so challenging from a drug development perspective. Tremor is a huge market, but from a drug design perspective, it's very hard. It's neurological. You need to develop a drug that attenuates tremor, but many of these approaches do this in a non-specific way, right? So the more you attenuate the tremor, the more you have side effects like fatigue and dizziness and somnolence, because you're sort of just aberrantly tamping down brain activity in a non-selective manner, right? I mean, we see this with anti-epileptics to some degree, but tremor, I think, is extra challenging, right? Because it's an elderly population that is not maybe as experienced as tolerating some of these sedative CNS drugs. So been a really tough space, appreciated as a big market. Praxis came out, and the big surprise here was that they had two readouts within this. One was a randomized withdrawal study, and one was an analysis of a parallel group aspect of the study. And they've had this phase 3 program that is a little bit complicated. I don't need to review, but it's got multiple trials and ways of analyzing this. And I mean, especially the parallel group data looks very good. I think there's going to be some debate around what is a clinically significant effect size in this condition. It reminds me a little bit of tardive dyskinesia, another movement disorder where it's hard to juice out a big effect size, and there's a lot of subjectivity around what even is clinically significant. But I don't have any skin in the game here. I follow almost everything in CNS, but this is one I don't formally cover. But from my look, I mean, this looks like it's likely an approvable product, and it's a huge market. And there were a lot of reasons why the expectations were low. Praxis has another program in epilepsy that is also a program that in my discussions with investors is a little bit polarizing. There's some who thinks that program is a potential blockbuster. There's others who, maybe are more critical and don't think that it's truly a new mechanism, and wonder really where it fits in an increasingly competitive focal epilepsy landscape. But I don't think a lot of people thought this tremor data would look like this. There were maybe some that thought that their randomized withdrawal study could hit, myself included, because I just think in CNS those studies almost always hit. But for the data across the board to be favorable like this is a big win for them. And they're a company that has, stuck at this and also made some tough decisions when times were tough, including, making cuts to extend cash runway. So yeah, that's my take. Anyone else following this closely?
I'm not particularly following it closely, although I have been fascinated by, the development of new treatments for, essential tremor or movement disorders, because historically it's been just so challenging, right? I mean, we look at our experience with Parkinson's disease, and while we have a lot of drugs, we really don't have any really good newer drugs, at least it seems. I feel like levodopa, carbidopa is still the long-standing standard of care, which is, I don't know, proved maybe 60 years ago. So I thought it was fantastic to see the Praxis data. I don't cover it. I don't follow it closely. I've met the company in the past. I do think it's interesting to see two things. One, hopefully it does get approved and what the market opportunity is. But I was thrilled to see them be able to raise so much money afterwards, which hopefully, secures at least decent funding for them to be able to flesh out the rest of their programs. I do think we're seeing on good data, like, fairly robust financings. And in many cases, companies are able to add cash that gives them, sometimes 2, if not 3 years of extra cash runway. And that has been such the major issue for our sector for the past 4 years now.
Yeah, I'm with you, man. I mean, it's just amazing. You look back since Labor Day. I mean, MBX, Rapport, Unicure. I'm sure there's 4 or 5 others I'm not thinking of, but just big stock upside reactions on data, and in some cases bigger than I think investors were prepared for. And has emboldened people's confidence that you can get paid for taking on clinical risk. Eric, you want to talk about any of your other news items?
Well, I guess, sure. I always like to talk about my news items.
What's most interesting to you?
Let's go to Bicara. This is another little Boston company up your neck of the woods, and they had really had a very tough first 12 months as a public company. They were kind of the new kid on the block in this head and neck cancer space, and had some, I thought, very interesting phase 2 data. But the study that they had out was a little bit skimpy. It was presented at ASCO this past year, and what they showed, again, if you believe the data, and the N is small here, but they had very good response rates, very good long-term survival data, very good duration of response, really a consistent picture that was all supported by the biological mechanism in a huge area, head and neck cancer, that could, potentially be a $4 billion plus market and support many players. The problem with this stock up until recently was they had a competitor, and it was kind of the 800-pound gorilla in Maris that was more established, more credible history with investors, a bigger data set, and was telling a different narrative. And it's one of those situations, guys, and we've all seen them before, where you have this kind of he said, she said between two different companies. John, I know you were in many of these in your prior life as an operator, and yeah, I mean, nobody wins, right? It's just mudslinging back
No.
and forth, and usually there's one loser. Sometimes there are two losers, and lo and behold, Maris gets acquired for a nice premium, $8 billion, and the narrative just changes. It flips almost on a dime. So that's kind of what's going on here with this Bicara. They're now the last remaining company in the space. The storyline cannot be about comparing and contrasting. It can be about how there may be more strategic interest, and we should pay more attention to their data. And the stock's having a little run, capped off this week by breakthrough designation. So the FDA did grant that to the Bicara drug, and that's another cherry on their ice cream sundae, and hopefully more good times ahead for them. But it, I guess the message here is that rarely is healthcare and biotech and medicine a fight for market share. Almost always it's a fight for the size of the pie.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, Eric. I mean, it was such a, and this happens, and we've seen this happen before, and happened with a few of the Alnylam programs as well. It becomes an investor, he says, she says, I'm right, you're wrong. It's either or, and it's just not that way with making medicines. And I mean, the Mirus drug is great, the Bicara drug is awesome. And I have no doubt that both drugs will get out there, patients will benefit, and there's a lot of unmet need in head and neck, and a big pie, and it'll only grow. It'll only grow. So I'm completely aligned with you on this one.
Awesome. Greg, do you want to talk about this upcoming Alector data? And I'm going to just throw a couple thoughts of my own at you to see, because maybe we can have a little debate, or I'd love your perspective. So Alector's got this frontotemporal dementia data coming up later this year. It's a program partnered with GSK. This was a program, Greg, that I used to be a lot more positive on, because it does have this genetic medicine angle of increasing progranulin levels in patients who are progranulin deficient. I think over time, we felt like the mechanistic story here might be a lot more complicated as it relates to the whole sortilin mechanism, and the phase 1/2 open label data on neurofilament or clinical. It's just hard to really say much about it. And I don't think we've seen much updates beyond a year. So, given how tough this disease is, I certainly wish this would work. It would be great for the elector and great for the space, but I'm not holding my breath, but I'd be curious if you have another perspective.
Yeah, no, I mean, this whole neurodegenerative disease space is just so tough. I mean, ALS, Alzheimer's, and now we've got this frontotemporal dementia disease, which for those who don't know FTD, it's the disease that Bruce Willis, our beloved, diehard actor and moonlighting actor, is suffering from, unfortunately. But yes, they've got a very big, chunky top line phase 3 data readout in the middle of next month. We've been waiting for the results of this study for a long time. It is a long trial. And Paul, you're right. The prior data was probably not as clean as perhaps those of us would want to see, ideally speaking. I think the interesting thing, maybe for us to discuss here, is these neurodegenerative diseases, high unmet medical need. In this particular case, it is a fatal condition as well. And we are awaiting the results of the study, where, interestingly, there are two co-primary endpoints. It was a recent addition to or change to the SAP for the study, but there is an efficacy readout, and then just recently there was the addition of a biomarker based endpoint, which is there are now two co-primary endpoints. But with that being said, it'll be very interesting with respect to the data, which if you look at the market cap of Alector, it's something on the order of about 300 million dollars, let's call it. And as of June 30th, they had reported about 300 million in cash. So clearly the market is not ascribing a lot of value or expectation that this is going to work. And again, given the complexities of the disease, and that we have prior data that were not necessarily a slam dunk, I think it is prudent to be cautious on this. But we're all so attuned to looking at clinical trial outcomes, and you've got to hit 0.005 or better to be able to be a win, so to speak. It'll be very interesting to see what the efficacy data are with respect to this readout. I do think that you're talking about a neurology division that in the past has shown a fair amount of regulatory flexibility when it comes to perhaps controversial
Right.
drugs, right? In Alzheimer's and ALS, we've got three such examples, whether it's Aduhelm from Biogen, whether it is Qalsody from Biogen and Ionis, and the ALS drug from Amylyx Pharmaceuticals, Relivrio. So it'll be very interesting to see if they end up missing on the primary endpoint, what that p-value looks like, and how close or not close are they to achieving 0.05 or less. And I would offer that if they were to hit something like on a p-value, if they don't indeed hit on achieving the primary endpoint, but if they're at something like 0.07 or 0.08, it'll be very interesting to see what the FDA does for a disease where there isn't a lot of clinical trial activity. This is the first drug that's been taken to phase 3 by any company in the past. There are a few other programs on the competitive landscape, but again, they might be several years away in a condition that is fatal. So I would say an interesting readout. Again, one where the market currently doesn't expect it to work. And I agree, Paul, that there are many reasons why you can be skeptical. Yes, I'm hopeful as well, and we'll just see how it all turns out.
Yeah, totally. I'm certainly not pretending like I have a consensus view here, but thanks for the great overview and setup. So we've got a minute or two left. John, Eric, any last closing remarks from you guys on what's on your mind over the next few weeks?
The one thing I would say is, this New England Journal paper on the otoferlin story with Regeneron is just another proof point out there that gene therapy is not over. Look at Unicure. Look at this story, and gene therapy remains an important modality for some of these ultra rare diseases, and we shouldn't lose sight of that. That's my only last point.
Well, I'm heading to Berlin this weekend, and we're going to see a lot of innovation in cancer, which sometimes oncology is sometimes bashed a little bit by investors these days for being too crowded, too competitive, too fast paced. But boy, there's some great stuff coming out that we're looking forward to seeing.
Awesome. All right. Well, thanks everyone for joining. John, Greg, Eric, appreciate it. And thanks everyone for listening. And we'll look forward to hearing you on the next Biotech Hangout.